I thought I was walking into an ordinary Monday morning at the bakery where I'd worked for 2 years. Instead, I found every employee gathered around our new owner. The moment she turned around, my heart dropped. It was my mother-in-law, the same woman my husband had cut out of his life years ago. She looked at me, smiled, and shook my hand as if nothing had ever happened. That was the moment I realized my job was about to become a nightmare. What I didn't know was just how far she would go to force me out, and how my coworkers would eventually expose everything. For 2 years, that little bakery had been my second home. When I first walked through its doors, I was nothing more than a bakery assistant. I spent my days measuring ingredients, washing mixing bowls, preparing fillings, cleaning workstations, and trying to stay out of everyone's way. The experienced pastry chefs handled the difficult recipes while I quietly watched, memorized every step, and practiced whenever I had the chance. The work wasn't glamorous. Most mornings started before sunrise. By 5 o'clock the ovens were already heating up. Flour covered nearly every surface, and the smell of butter, vanilla, and freshly baked bread filled the kitchen. It was exhausting, but I genuinely loved it. Little by little, the head pastry chef began trusting me with more complicated tasks. First came decorating cupcakes, then assembling cakes. Eventually I was making desserts entirely on my own. By the end of my second year, I wasn't anyone's assistant anymore. I had become one of the bakery's full pastry chefs, responsible for preparing several of our best-selling desserts every single day. It felt good knowing I had earned that position instead of being handed it. There was another responsibility I enjoyed even more. During late spring, summer, and the warmer weeks of autumn, our bakery operated a small mobile coffee and dessert truck. We parked it at local festivals, farmers markets, community events, and weekend fairs. Customers could buy slices of cake, macarons, cookies, pastries, specialty coffee, and homemade lemonade. Managing that truck became my job. I ordered supplies, prepared inventory, handled customers, balanced the cash register, and made sure everything looked inviting. It was busy work, but I loved talking to people instead of spending every minute inside the kitchen. Our regular customers even started recognizing me. "If you're working today," one older gentleman joked every Saturday, "I already know my cappuccino will be perfect." Little comments like that made the long hours worth it. The bakery itself wasn't huge. There were around 15 employees, and after 2 years everyone knew everyone else's routines. Emily handled bread production. Carlos specialized in chocolate. Jenny decorated wedding cakes better than anyone I'd ever seen. Mike worked the ovens. Sarah managed the front counter. Our owner, Mr. Reynolds, had built the bakery from scratch nearly 20 years earlier. He wasn't the easiest boss. He expected quality, hated excuses, and noticed every mistake. But he was fair. If you worked hard, he appreciated it. If something went wrong, he'd explain how to fix it instead of humiliating you. That kind of management created loyalty. Most of us had worked there for years, which was why the announcement came as such a surprise. One Monday morning, I arrived a little earlier than usual. Instead of everyone getting ready for the day's production, the staff had gathered near the front counter. People were whispering. Someone laughed nervously. Mr. Reynolds stood beside a woman dressed in an expensive cream-colored blazer. I had only seen the back of her head as I walked in. Then she turned around. The tray I was carrying nearly slipped from my hands. It was my mother-in-law. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was imagining things. But no, there she was. Perfect hairstyle. Designer handbag. The same cold expression she'd worn every single time we'd met. Mr. Reynolds smiled at the staff. "I wanted everyone here this morning because I have an important announcement." Nobody said a word. "I've decided it's finally time to retire." A few employees gasped. Others looked completely shocked. "I've sold the bakery," he continued. "Starting today, our new owner will be Mrs. Catherine Walker." She stepped forward confidently. "I know changes can make people nervous," she said with a polished smile. "But I believe this bakery has incredible potential, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you." Then her eyes landed on me. Just for a moment, the smile didn't disappear, but something in her expression changed. It was almost impossible to notice unless you already knew her. I did. That tiny look told me everything. She hadn't expected to see me either, and she definitely wasn't happy about it. After introducing herself to everyone else, she reached me last. "Emily tells me you're one of our pastry chefs," she said pleasantly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I am." "Wonderful." She held out her hand. I shook it. Her grip tightened slightly. "Looks like we'll be seeing quite a lot of each other." Anyone else would have thought it sounded friendly. To me it sounded like a warning. The truth was complicated. My husband, Daniel, hadn't spoken to his mother for years before she unexpectedly came back into his life. When he was 15, she'd simply disappeared. No dramatic goodbye. No explanation that made sense. She left him with his father and started building an entirely new life somewhere else. Birthdays passed. Graduations came and went. Years disappeared. She wasn't there for any of it. Daniel stopped expecting phone calls. Stopped hoping she'd come back. Eventually, he accepted that she had chosen another family over him. Then, about a year ago, she returned. She claimed she'd made mistakes. She wanted another chance. She wanted forgiveness. Daniel agreed to meet her exactly once. I went with him for support. The conversation lasted less than an hour. She barely apologized. Instead, she spent most of the lunch explaining how difficult her own life had been and why she deserved understanding. At one point, she even criticized Daniel for being too emotional about something that had happened years earlier. When we left the restaurant, he looked exhausted. "I can't do this," he told me quietly. I know. That was the last time he willingly saw her. As for me, she had disliked me almost immediately. Maybe because I supported Daniel instead of encouraging reconciliation. Maybe because she realized I wasn't going to pressure him into forgiving her. Or maybe she simply needed someone else to blame. Whatever the reason, every encounter after that became uncomfortable. She criticized my clothes, my career, the apartment Daniel and I rented, even the fact that I worked weekends. "You're too talented to stay in food service forever," she'd once said. "I actually love my job." She smiled politely. "I'm sure you'll grow out of that." Now she owned the bakery where I'd built my career. As I changed into my uniform that morning, a single thought kept repeating in my head. This wasn't going to end well. For the first few days, nothing happened. At least nothing obvious. Mrs. Walker spent most of her time walking through the bakery with a notebook in her hands, observing how everything worked. She asked questions about suppliers, recipes, schedules, inventory, and daily sales. On the surface, she seemed like a new owner who simply wanted to understand the business before making changes. Everyone tried to make a good impression. So did I. No matter what our personal history was, this was still my workplace. I reminded myself every morning to stay professional, do my job well, and avoid unnecessary conversations with her. For a short while, that strategy actually seemed to work. Then the inspections started. One Tuesday morning, I was piping buttercream onto a birthday cake when she appeared beside my station. She didn't say hello. She simply stood there watching. I finished the decoration before looking up. "Is something wrong?" She tilted her head. "The roses are a little uneven." I looked at the cake again. They weren't. Even Jenny, who had taught me that decorating technique, later admitted she couldn't see any difference between the flowers. Still, I scraped them off and made them again. Mrs. Walker watched the entire process before walking away without another word. I figured maybe she was just being overly detail-oriented. The next day, she inspected the fruit tarts I had finished. The strawberries should overlap more. I rearranged them. The day after that, she questioned the amount of chocolate drizzle on a batch of eclairs. "It looks inconsistent." I made another tray. Then she decided my workstation wasn't organized efficiently. Then my storage containers weren't labeled clearly enough. Then my pastry bags weren't folded correctly. None of the issues were serious. None of them affected quality. But somehow, every shift included another criticism. At first, I convinced myself I was overthinking everything. New owners often wanted things done differently. That was normal. Except, she wasn't correcting everyone. Only me. One Friday afternoon, Emily quietly walked over while I was restocking ingredients. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Has she always been this? Interested in your work?" I pretended not to understand. "What do you mean?" Emily lowered her voice. "I've worked here almost 6 years. So, I've never seen a manager inspect one employee this much. I forced a smile. I'm probably just imagining it. Emily didn't look convinced. Neither was I. A week later, Mrs. Walker announced that she would personally review every dessert before it went into the display case. At least that's what she said. In reality, she only reviewed mine. One morning she stopped me just before I loaded desserts into the refrigerated display. "Leave those here. They're ready. I'll decide that." She spent nearly 15 minutes examining every tart, every cookie, every eclair. Customers had already started walking into the shop. The front counter needed those desserts. Still, she refused to let me move them. Finally, she pointed at one lemon tart. "The crust has a tiny crack." It did. A crack barely wider than a fingernail. "The filling is perfect," I replied carefully. "It'll sell within minutes. I don't like imperfections. So should I remake the whole tart?" "The entire batch." I stared at her. "There are 24 of them." "I know how many there are. Remaking them took nearly 2 hours. The original batch sold to the staff during lunch because there had been absolutely nothing wrong with them." Carlos shook his head while eating one. "If these are defective," he laughed. "I wish all desserts were defective." I smiled. Mrs. Walker didn't. Instead, she wrote something inside her notebook. After that, every tiny mistake became a formal conversation. If I finished a task 5 minutes later than expected, she noticed. If one coffee cup was facing the wrong direction inside the truck, she noticed. If a supplier delivered ingredients late, somehow that became my responsibility too. Managing the dessert truck became especially stressful. It had always been one of my favorite parts of the job. Now it felt like taking an exam every weekend. Mrs. Walker would arrive unexpectedly at community events just to inspect everything. She counted inventory herself, checked expiration dates, measured refrigerator temperatures, watched me prepare drinks, even timed how long it took me to serve customers. One Saturday, after I'd spent 6 nonstop hours serving what felt like half the town, she approached the truck just as the line finally disappeared. "You've been smiling less today." I blinked. "I'm sorry. Customer service matters." "I've been serving people since 8 this morning." "Exactly. I've also made over 100 coffees." She folded her arms. "And? I don't understand. If you're tired, perhaps someone else should manage the truck." That comment stayed with me all evening. Not because it was true, because it wasn't. The event organizer later thanked me for handling one of the busiest Saturdays they'd had all summer. Customers complimented the service. Several even left positive online reviews mentioning me by name. Mrs. Walker ignored every single one. Instead, she emailed me Sunday night. Subject: areas that require improvement. The email contained 11 bullet points. Most of them were ridiculous. You paused too long before greeting one customer. The pastry display could appear more symmetrical. The coffee lids should all face the same direction. Your posture behind the counter could appear more professional. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. When Daniel asked what was wrong, I simply smiled. "Long weekend." He kissed my forehead. "You worked too hard." Maybe I did. But I still couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. He already carried enough pain where his mother was concerned. The last thing I wanted was to become another reason for them to argue. So I kept everything to myself. I smiled at work. I reassured my coworkers. I came home pretending everything was fine. Until pretending became impossible. Because Mrs. Walker wasn't satisfied with criticizing my work anymore. She had started documenting every tiny detail, building a file of supposed performance issues. And I had the uncomfortable feeling she wasn't doing it to improve the bakery. She was doing it to get rid of me. I managed to keep everything from Daniel for almost 6 weeks. Every evening I'd come home mentally exhausted, but I'd convince myself that tomorrow would be better. I didn't want him worrying about me, and I definitely didn't want him confronting his mother because of me. So I kept saying the same thing. Work was busy. I'm just tired. It'll settle down. But stress has a way of following you home. I started waking up in the middle of the night thinking about work. I replayed every conversation with Mrs. Walker in my head, wondering if I had actually made a mistake, or if she was simply looking for reasons to criticize me. Some mornings I felt anxious before I even walked into the bakery. That wasn't like me. I had always loved my job. Now I found myself checking the parking lot before going inside. If her car was already there, my stomach tightened. One evening Daniel noticed me staring silently at my dinner. "You've barely eaten." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." I smiled. "I'm just tired." He reached across the table. "You've been saying that for weeks." I looked away. He waited. Daniel had always been patient. He never pushed me to talk before I was ready. Finally I sighed. "I don't want you getting upset." "I'm already upset. Because I can tell something's wrong." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then everything came out. I told him about the constant inspections, the pointless criticism, the notebook she carried everywhere, the emails, the way she questioned every decision I made while leaving everyone else alone. His expression changed with every sentence. By the time I finished, he looked furious. I knew she hadn't changed. "Daniel." "No." He stood up from the table. "She promised she'd become a different person." "I don't want you fighting with her." "I'm not fighting." He picked up his phone. "I'm setting a boundary." She answered almost immediately. I could only hear his side of the conversation. "I know what you've been doing." "No." "Don't pretend you don't understand." "My wife has never given you a reason to treat her this way." "Leave her alone." "I'm not meeting you." "And I'm not changing my mind." He ended the call without another word. For a second the apartment was completely silent. What did she say? "That you're imagining things." I wasn't surprised. "And she also said she expects higher standards from family." I laughed bitterly. "Funny." "What?" "I'm apparently only family when it's convenient." Daniel wrapped his arms around me. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I brought her back into our lives." "No," I said quietly. "She did." I hoped that conversation would finally make her stop. Instead, everything became worse. The very next morning she called me into her office before my shift had even started. She closed the door. "I heard Daniel contacted me." I stayed calm. "He asked you to treat me fairly." She ignored my answer. "I don't appreciate employees discussing workplace matters outside the business." "I discussed them with my husband, who also happens to be my son." "Exactly." Her expression hardened. "You should have stayed out of our relationship." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I didn't create your relationship." "No." She looked directly into my eyes. "But you've certainly influenced it." From that day on, she stopped pretending her inspections were routine. They became personal. She reassigned me to less desirable shifts with almost no notice. She scheduled inventory counts right before I was supposed to leave. If the dessert truck needed someone to arrive an hour earlier than everyone else, it was me. If someone had to stay late cleaning after an event, it was me. Whenever there was an unpleasant task that nobody wanted, my name somehow appeared on the schedule. The strange part was that my performance reviews still contained nothing serious. There were pages of comments. Very few actual mistakes. Just opinions. Needs to improve efficiency. Needs stronger attention to presentation. Needs better communication. Nothing specific enough to justify disciplinary action. Just enough to create pressure. My coworkers noticed. At first they only exchanged looks whenever she walked away. Then they started speaking up. One afternoon Carlos found me reorganizing the storage room for the third time that week. "Did she tell you to do this again? Apparently the shelves aren't arranged logically." He looked around. "They're alphabetical." "I know. They've always been alphabetical." "I know." He shook his head. "This isn't about shelves." A few days later Emily quietly approached me during lunch. "Can we sit outside for a minute?" We carried our coffees to the bench behind the bakery. She looked unusually serious. "I need to ask you something." "Okay. Is there history between you two?" I hesitated. She noticed. "So there is." I slowly nodded. "She's my mother-in-law." Emily nearly dropped her coffee. "What?" "My husband's mother." She stared at me for several seconds. That explains everything. I was hoping nobody would notice. We all noticed. What do you mean? Emily sighed. We've been talking. Who has? Everyone. I frowned. About me. About what's happening. According to Emily, several coworkers had independently started keeping track of Mrs. Walker's behavior. Not because I asked them to, because they couldn't ignore it anymore. Carlos remembered how many times she'd interrupted my work compared to everyone else's. Sarah noticed that customer complaints involving other employees disappeared, while even compliments about me were ignored. Mike pointed out that I was being assigned the least desirable shifts almost every week. Jenny had seen Mrs. Walker reject cakes that she herself believed were flawless. It isn't subtle anymore, Emily said. I didn't want everyone involved. They're already involved. I looked toward the bakery window. Inside, everyone was working like usual. From the outside, nothing looked different. But now I realized I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't been overreacting. The people who worked beside me every day had seen it too. And they were getting tired of watching it happen. A few days after my conversation with Emily, something happened that changed everything. Mrs. Walker called our weekly staff meeting. She said she wanted to discuss improving accountability. We all gathered in the kitchen before opening. She stood at the front holding a folder. I've spent the last 2 months evaluating our workflow, she began. Unfortunately, I've noticed that some employees are not meeting the standards I expect. Without mentioning my name immediately, she started listing examples. Late preparation, poor organization, inconsistent presentation, weak communication. Every example described something I had supposedly done. Everyone in the room knew exactly who she was talking about. When she finally looked at me, she said, "Some people have become too comfortable here." The room fell silent. I expected everyone to look away. Instead, Carlos spoke first. "I don't think that's fair." Mrs. Walker looked surprised. "Excuse me. I work beside her every day," he continued. "She's one of the hardest working people here." Emily nodded. "So do I." Then Sarah joined in. "I've never had problems with her desserts or the truck." Jenny added, "If you're questioning the quality of her cakes, then you're questioning my training too." For a moment, nobody said anything. Mrs. Walker forced a smile. "I appreciate everyone's loyalty, but management decisions are my responsibility." "No one's arguing that," Mike replied calmly. "We're saying your evaluations don't match what actually happens here." It was the first time anyone had challenged her openly. She ended the meeting within minutes. The atmosphere inside the bakery felt different afterward. People weren't whispering anymore. They were talking openly. Not about gossip. About fairness. That afternoon, Emily approached me again. "We've made a decision." "We." "The rest of us." She handed me a folder. Inside were printed emails, shift schedules, written statements, copies of customer reviews, and notes several coworkers had kept over the previous weeks. I looked at her in disbelief. "You've been collecting all this?" "We wanted facts." Carlos walked over. "If we were going to say something, we wanted proof." Mike joined us, so nobody could say we were exaggerating. I slowly turned the pages. There were dates, specific incidents, examples of me being assigned extra work while others weren't, records showing positive customer feedback that had never been acknowledged, schedules proving I had received nearly every closing shift for over a month despite the rotation system we'd always followed before. It wasn't just my word anymore. It was evidence. "What are you planning to do?" I asked. Emily answered without hesitation. "We're filing a formal complaint." Mrs. Walker hadn't simply purchased the bakery. She had bought it through an investment group that owned several local businesses. Although she managed the bakery herself, she still reported to a regional operations director. Most employees didn't even know that. Emily did. She had handled enough administrative work over the years to understand how the company was structured. The following Monday, 7 employees signed the complaint. Not because they disliked Mrs. Walker. Not because they wanted a different boss. Because they believed what was happening wasn't right. The complaint included everything. Documentation, witness statements, shift records, copies of emails, customer reviews, Even photos showing desserts she had rejected that later sold immediately to employees, because there was nothing wrong with them. Then we waited. About 2 weeks later, 2 representatives from the company arrived unexpectedly. They spent the entire day inside the bakery. They interviewed everyone separately. Nobody knew what anyone else had said. No one compared answers beforehand. We simply told the truth. They asked me dozens of questions. How long had I worked there? When did the behavior begin? Was it consistent? Had I ever received similar complaints before Mrs. Walker became the owner? I answered honestly, no. Then they asked the same questions to everyone else. Business continued almost normally for another week. Mrs. Walker acted as though nothing had happened. She stopped making comments toward me altogether. She barely acknowledged me. It was almost more uncomfortable than the constant criticism. Then, one Friday morning, I arrived to find 2 unfamiliar people standing in the office with her. The conversation behind the closed door lasted nearly an hour. When she finally came out, she didn't look at anyone. She picked up her handbag, collected a few personal belongings, walked straight past the kitchen, and left. No speech, no goodbye, no explanation. About 20 minutes later, one of the representatives gathered us together. I know everyone has questions, he said. Mrs. Walker will no longer be managing this location, while the company completes its internal review. Someone quietly asked, who's taking over? We've appointed an interim manager until a permanent replacement is selected. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. We simply went back to work. The bakery suddenly felt lighter. Not because everything was magically perfect again, but because people no longer felt like they were walking on eggshells. Within days, the atmosphere changed completely. Everyone laughed more. The kitchen sounded like it used to. The dessert truck became enjoyable again. Customers noticed the difference too. One regular smiled at me while picking up his usual cappuccino. You look happier lately. I think I am. A few weeks later, the company announced that Mrs. Walker would not be returning to manage the bakery. Another experienced manager from one of their locations accepted the position permanently. She introduced herself on her first day by saying something simple. I'm here to support the people who already know how to run this bakery. That was all anyone wanted to hear. As for Daniel, he never contacted his mother again. Neither did I. There wasn't anything left to say. Sometimes people assume that the hardest part of a difficult workplace is the amount of work itself. It isn't. Long hours can be managed. Busy weekends eventually end. Early mornings become routine. What wears people down is feeling like nothing they do will ever be good enough, because someone has already decided they don't belong. I'm grateful my coworkers saw what was happening before I started believing it myself. If they had stayed silent, I probably would have convinced myself that I really was failing. Instead, they reminded me of something important. A healthy workplace isn't built by one owner. It's built by people who are willing to stand up for each other when something isn't right. 2 years after I first walked into that bakery as an inexperienced assistant, I was still there. Still making desserts. Still managing the coffee truck every summer. Still greeting many of the same regular customers. The only difference was that I no longer walked through the front door wondering what I had done wrong. I could simply do the job I loved. And that was more than enough.